Hello and welcome to Afternoon Briefing. I'm Greg Jennett.
And I'm Fran Kelly, joining you from Parliament House on Ngunnawal country.
Great to have you back here in our studio, Fran. And for my own part, it feels good to be back here too after a little dash to Western Australia for that Labor Party launch over the weekend, which kept us busy enough and no doubt will in the days ahead as well, because we still seem to be discussing or picking over some of the main themes that were embedded in that launch. We have actually already passed the halfway mark in this campaign, so the remainder is about repeating what was done in the first half, Fran, only with more urgency in the countdown to the 21st of May.
Oh, well, I hope they can manage a bit more than that, Craig. But Day 22 has taken Anthony Albanese to Brisbane for a Labor Day rally, building on the Better Future theme of his campaign launch yesterday. And it's led Scott Morrison back towards Geelong and the marginal seat of Corangamite, selling a promise to expand access to a retiree's concession card.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Allahu Akbar.
In the name of
Good morning. We can reflect as you do here today.
We know the cost of housing is very high. What we need to do is to have a whole of government approach.
People cannot continue to go backwards in their pay and conditions.
We can't keep 10,000 people waiting. We can't keep 10,000 people waiting. Thank you.
Workers united will never be defeated.
Extinction Rebellion, what are you doing for climate action?
Morning, Prime Minister, how are you? There's not a lot we can do about things that are happening overseas that are impacting on our economy. But these practical things that we're doing as a government makes those cost of living pressures just that bit more able to be dealt with. Now, if you don't have an economic plan, everything else you talk about is just making stuff up. Labor has a plan where they want the government to own your home.
Only Labor has a plan for a better future.
The bank has the first call over it, the government has the second call over it.
That's our plan for a better future.
And you come last when it comes to your own home.
We need a Labor government with a better plan for a better future. See you, folks.
Yeah, so that was Day 22, and you can make out the outlines of a few policy debates that were rippling away there. One, quite obviously, was about this shared equity policy that Labor launched. That's over housing, where governments would take a stake to help people get into homes. Scott Morrison has really tried to trash that, pressing forcefully this argument that governments might in some way muscle their way in and then muscle owners out financially if they became co-investors in a private home. It does seem, Fran, as though the Prime Minister's using just a little bit of rhetorical licence here, but really a far more immediate pressure point looks like it's going to be applied as early as tomorrow to homeowners with a mortgage. That's when the Reserve Bank Board meets to consider official interest rate settings.
That's right. We're going to take a closer look with some housing experts at Labor's policy. But in terms of the rate rise, the impending rate rise, it could be tomorrow. The Prime Minister's very keen to get out in front of that one, Greg, trying to depoliticise a rate rise that would start the inevitable march towards higher interest rates all up, giving himself cover for any blame, I think, that's going to be flung about by Labor. Scott Morrison says when it comes to their own mortgages, Australians know what they're doing, and they know that what went down in the slowing economy of the pandemic years was always going to come back up again. Politics, he says, has nothing to do with whatever the RBA does tomorrow.
So tomorrow, it's not about me, it's not about Mr Albanese, it's not about the Treasurer or the Shadow Treasurer. It's about Australians themselves and the decisions they're making and understanding the pressures on the economy and who they think is going to be better able to manage those pressures into the future.
Yeah, but is that a bit of a wishful thinking there? I think from the Prime Minister, Greg, there is no way in the world that Labor won't try and pin a rate rise on this coalition government, which has been in power, after all, for 10 years. If the bank lifts rates tomorrow, it's going to fit so snugly into Labor's campaign slogan that everything's been going up except for your wages. And the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was giving the Prime Minister an early taste of that line of attack if the Reserve Bank does jump tomorrow.
Yeah, he was back in Queensland, Jim Chalmers, from a couple of days there in Western Australia. Already warming to this theme that you're foreshadowing here, Fran, focused squarely on three prongs of cost of living pain, piercing sharply into household budgets.
Whether the Reserve Bank raises interest rates this week or next month, Scott Morrison's economic credibility is in tatters. This is the third wave of Scott Morrison's cost of living crisis. This is a triple whammy of falling real wages, skyrocketing inflation, and interest rates are about to rise as well.
So we've referred a little to Labor's housing policy, the Prime Minister going on the attack. As I mentioned, we'll look at it with some experts a bit later. But there was a coalition policy promised today too, Greg. The government's adding around 50,000 older Australians to the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, which brings discounts and other benefits that are currently enjoyed by about 430,000 people. And it's doing this by raising the amount of income eligible retirees can earn, up to $90,000 a year for a single self-funded retiree, or $144,000 for a couple. So that's quite a lot.
And the increases just of their own were large, actually, even though some people would argue it brings you broadly into line with household income figures more generally outside of the retiree cohort. But this is, of course, retirees we're talking about here, an important constituency in any election. The coalition promise was readily adopted by Labor, seeking to neutralise all of this, keen to avoid any scrap over something that it accepts is needed as a cost of living relief measure.
If it's a bribe and it's not right, why support it?
We support the measure. We know that people are under cost of living pressures, and where there's a good idea, we will support it.
And we've seen a bit of that from Anthony Albanese. There's no way Labor's going to allow a gap to open up on cost of living. We saw it in the government's budget. Labor was straight there supporting the cut to petrol excise and some of the other payments. Yet today we saw that from Anthony Albanese. Fits into his theme of he's a unifier, not a divider too. So he keeps saying when we see a good idea, we'll support it. We're not here for division. We're here to bring the country together and move it forward. Yeah,
picking your battles out of the text.
That's another way of saying it.
That particular play. Why don't we move off now to some regional affairs, because we earlier heard today from the Solomon Islands High Commissioner to Canberra, and he appears to be trying to pour oil on what have been very choppy waters in the southwest Pacific between that island nation and Australia. He's offered public assurances that this country will remain a primary security ally of choice to Solomon Islands, but of course that relationship will still need further work after this election. For his assessment of some of these issues and some domestic campaigning matters too, earlier I spoke to Liberal Senator and Chair of Parliament's Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, James Paterson. Well, James Paterson, we've had Solomon Islands High Commissioner to Australia trying to reassure this country today that it remains security partner of choice for that small Pacific nation. Do you actually believe that?
Greg, I didn't see the High Commissioner's interview live, but I've read some reports about it since, and I welcome his comments. I welcome his statements about our shared values and our shared interests, which I think are really important. I welcome his commitment that the government of the Solomon Islands will release their security agreement with China. I think that's important. And I welcome him restating that Australia is the Solomon Islands partner of choice when it comes to security matters. That's certainly how we've regarded the relationship, and it's good to have that official confirmation, because history shows when the Solomon Islands needs assistance, it is Australia that steps in and provided that assistance, whether it's the Ramsay intervention over many years, which successfully brought stability and security to the people of Solomon Islands, or more recent assistance provided by the Australian Federal Police and our armed forces when we're called upon to do so. We will always stand with our Pacific friends and family.
So if you found comfort in the work words of the High Commissioner. How then sat with your ear the comments by Prime Minister Sogavare in the Parliament of Solomon Islands last week when he said his nation didn't become theatrical and hysterical when it found out about the secret AUKUS subs deal? Was that an overreach by the Prime Minister?
Well, Prime Minister Sogavare is right. In fact, they didn't raise any concerns at all with us about the AUKUS agreement, and nor should they have any concerns about the AUKUS agreement, because Australia has a very good track record of being transparent and open with our international engagements, whether they relate to security, economic matters, or any other areas.
Could we assume, though, James Paterson, that we had consulted via front channels or back channels our Pacific neighbours before entering into it? That doesn't seem to square with the record of who knew what on the AUKUS deal.
Well, we certainly don't run secret agreements by anyone in advance of releasing them. That wouldn't be appropriate, and there's no expectation that we'd do so. But we very quickly communicated to our friends and partners in the region about the deal once it was publicly available, and that's appropriate. And I think that's exactly how we should handle those things. And we're completely open and transparent about it. We're very, very proud of what will be delivered under the AUKUS agreement. We're very happy to open that up to scrutiny. The Chinese government doesn't have the same track record. The Chinese government negotiates in secret and then keeps the details of those agreements secret afterwards, and is not open about that. And they have reason to do that because they're not willing to be upfront about it. Yeah.
Why would it be a threat to Australia's national security if, again, to use the High Commissioner's words, maybe we just want to diversify our sources of security assistance rather than relying on Australia every time? Why would that concept of diversification necessarily represent a problem for Australia?
Well, I welcome the comments of the High Commissioner in that regard, and also of Prime Minister Sogavare, that there will never be a permanent Chinese military presence or a Chinese naval base on the Solomon Islands territory, because that would be a threat to the stability and security of the whole region and would be unwelcome to a number of Pacific island partners and friends, not just Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Japan and others. And of course, we absolutely recognise that it is the sovereign right of the Solomon Islands government to enter into whatever agreements it sees fit. We will just honestly and transparently provide our feedback about whether or not we think it's in the interests of the region and regional stability.
Do you think, or do you assess that trust has in any way been damaged from Australia's perspective, looking out towards the government of Solomon Islands and its Prime Minister, in view not only of the lead up to the signing of the deal, but some of the remarks made subsequently to the Parliament there?
I don't think it's appropriate for me as a parliamentarian to be a commentator on the relationship. All I can speak to is how Australia sees the relationship, which is one that is very valued and very important to us, and which we proudly engage in and have for many years. We're very proud of the assistance that we offer the Solomon Islands in traditional forms of development assistance. We're very proud of the security assistance that we've offered for a long time. We're very proud during the pandemic that we were the partner of choice to providing COVID-19 vaccines, and we hold out our hand and we're open to continue to being that well into the future. All
right. Well, as a parliamentarian, then why don't I bring you back to what's going on within our country, and that is, of course, the democratic election halfway underway by now, through the campaign at least. In the state of Victoria, how much trouble is Josh Frydenberg in Kooyong? He seems to be pedalling particularly hard this time around.
Josh Frydenberg has never taken the people of Kooyong for granted. I live in Kooyong. I'm a constituent of Josh's as well as being a colleague of his, and it's amazing how he's been able to maintain a very high tempo of commitment and work in the local electorate while balancing the incredibly important job of being Treasurer of Australia, particularly during the pandemic when he was called upon so much to design policies like JobKeeper, which helped save so many small businesses around the country and in his electorate. He's working very hard to earn the support of the people of Kooyong, and I think he's got a very compelling offering, because if they vote for him, they'll continue to be represented at the highest levels in Canberra and have influence over the direction of the country. If they vote for an independent, it's not really clear what they're getting at all. This independent, being a former member of the Labor Party, refuses to say whether or not she would side with the coalition or with the Labor Party in the event of a hung parliament, and is not open about her policies and the impact they would have or the cost that they would require.
Yeah, I think there was a few grumbles within the Victorian Liberal Party last time around around that Josh Frydenberg might have, drawn a few resources or even a few too many resources into the protection of Kooyong to try and save him, given his seniority. Would that equally apply, that criticism, this time around, given the struggle seems even more intense for him?
I think that's a very unfair criticism if anyone's made it. I haven't heard it directly. Josh Frydenberg well and truly funds and resources his own campaigns and then some. He's one of our most compelling supporters of other candidates in Victoria, whether that's through fundraising or volunteering or campaigning. He's a very active and very welcome presence because he's very highly regarded by the Victorian people. They remember how he stood up for them in the darkest days of lockdowns during the pandemic, and they recognise his leadership on the national level and how many jobs and small businesses he helped save with his policies. So that's certainly not a criticism I've encountered.
No, although on that final point about the spending during the pandemic, that's something that Victorian Premier Dan Andrews has taken up directly. Is there a sense in which Josh Frydenberg might be paying a price through anger because of remarks that he had made as he withdrew some of those stimulus payments on the way through?
Well, what Josh Frydenberg and the federal government did was the responsible thing. We provided incredibly generous assistance when it was needed, but as the pandemic evolved, as vaccines became available, as lockdowns came to an end, we tapered that out in a measured way to ensure that small businesses and jobs were supported, but also to ensure that the Commonwealth taxpayer didn't continue to bear a very significant burden of that assistance. That's not something that could ever continue in perpetuity. They were extraordinary schemes for extraordinary times, and it was appropriate that they were temporary. It doesn't reflect well at all on the Labor Party that they first said they supported JobKeeper, then attacked it, then said they would have continued it when it was no longer necessary. And the facts bear this out. I mean, we now have a 4% unemployment rate. That is a testament to the success of JobKeeper.
Sure, let's see where that argument goes in the remaining 3 weeks. James Paterson, thanks again for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks, Craig.
Party campaign launches are a pretty big moment in every election campaign, and curiously, this election, Labor chose to have their official launch at the midway point, which is much earlier than usual. Speaking to the party faithful in Perth yesterday, it was a sea of red as Anthony Albanese made his pitch to his fellow Australians to give him their votes on the 21st of May.
I know we have been through tough times. I know the sacrifices that so many of you have made. You have earned a better future, and on the 21st of May, I am asking you to vote for that better future. Vote for hope and optimism, not fear and division. Vote Labor so together we can build a better future for all Australians. Thank you very much.
Well, Greg, you were there. You saw every single word of it, spoke to all the main players before and after. What did you think of the Labor launch? Looking at home from the couch, was perhaps less glamorous, less kind of glitter than usual, but pretty strong Labor messages punched out from it.
It did what it had to. I mean, there was no more room to move there in that official launch than there is over the whole 6 weeks of the campaign for Labor financially. That's why, even the more generous initiatives that were embedded in their platform there yesterday were modest, really. I mean, 10,000 homeowner assistance incentives, I suppose you would call it, through this shared equity scheme.
So money for affordable housing, really, helping more people get into housing. There was a commitment to gender equity in wages. So women, the low paid in terms of housing.
Cost of living again on your pharmaceutical benefits scheme, out-of-pocket expenses. So
the young, the old, the sick was a line he used a few times.
Childcare, Medicare, aged care. So you're combining all your Labor values along with some modest but no doubt necessary spending for the Labor heartland. So, look, it did its job.
He had quite a few warm-up acts, I noticed at home as I was watching. There was sort of one after the other. Went Penny Wong, and then I think it was Jason Clare. But the big one was Mark McGowan, who talked for quite a long time. It's no accident that it was in the West. It's a long way to travel for your campaign launch. A lot of money and time wrapped up in that. Yep. So clearly, Labor's Anthony Albanese is hoping to get a bit of the gloss that might rub off from a very popular state premier.
Well, not just that. I mean, he was, and I think still is, a very popular Mark McGowan, but you also had Peter Malinauskas there from South Australia as well, the most recently successful Labor campaigner on the national stage. So, yeah, it definitely had that feel about it that, you know, the Labor brethren and the sisterhood sort of reunite when they have to every 3 years. Anthony Albanese is a creature of the party for 26 years in this place, the Parliament House. He is one of them.
The biggest cheers, as always, for the former Prime Ministers, Kevin Rudd and Paul Keating. Much loved Labor icons, really, both of them, aren't they? And
so their presence was really valued as well, and that's all woven into it. The new players, your Malinauskases, your McGowans, and your Labor traditional veterans all united. It was a nice piece of craftsmanship, I suppose, and stage management, and they pulled it off.
Well, I think it did sort of what Anthony Albanese had to do. I'm joined now, speaking of political veterans, by two veterans of political campaigning, our regulars here on Afternoon Briefing throughout this election, former Labor Minister Craig Emerson and former Liberal Minister Christopher Pyne. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Fran.
Thank you, Fran. Nice to be here. Hello, Craig.
Hi, Christopher. Craig. I don't know about this elders bit. What about Labor legends or party legends?
Legends. We've got to be real. We've got to choose our word. Luminaries. I'll go with luminaries.
Rightio.
Craig, let's start with you because of the Labor launch, a campaign launch of Perth. Very early in the campaign, we know Labor's trying to hunt for at least 3 seats in the West. But what's the thinking around having this midway in the campaign? What's that thinking?
It is a little bit early. I was thinking about that the other day. But at the same time, the tradition has crept to the point where campaign launches have been, occurred 7 days before polling day, which is also a bit weird. So I think it's probably a reasonable balance. Pull it back a bit and then spend the rest of the campaign, still communicating the messages that were created for and voiced during the campaign launch itself.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to get bogged down on the timing, Christopher, but, let me ask you the opposite question. Why, for the coalition, why so late for the coalition?
Well, campaign launches are traditionally a big springboard, and I think Labor's decided to flip that around, do it early in the campaign. What I found curious, really, Fran, was that they were having it in Perth. I mean, if you'd already believed that you were going to win the 2 or 3 seats that you need to win to form government out of Western Australia, you wouldn't need to have the launch in Perth. I would have thought you'd have it in Queensland or in Sydney. So I found that an interesting aspect to the launch. They obviously still feel the need to work hard in those Perth seats. They haven't got them in their column yet. That was my takeout from the launch. I also thought the launch was muted. Labor didn't go for a very glitzy or glamorous campaign launch. They usually do. So, that's an interesting development. We'll see how it plays out. Labor's certainly in the box seat right now, but 3 weeks is a long time in politics, especially in an election campaign. And
how much weight do these events carry? I mean, I agree with you, Christopher. I thought there was a bit less glitz and glamour than normal. But Craig, does anyone beyond the party faithful and political journalists like me sit at home on a Sunday afternoon and watch these things? Do they change minds?
Probably. I don't know how it rated live. I wouldn't think it would be a box office hit, nor the Liberal campaign when it's held during the day. But this Sunday evening news would be, it would have been carried on all the major channels. So I think people either watch that with interest or watch it accidentally because they're watching the commercial news for other reasons. They only watch, of course, the ABC to, get the wisdom from the ABC. But I think it's really, Sunday night news are very, very high rating around, the whole week. So there's some sense in that. And of course, you probably want to do it on a Sunday when people are around and taking it a bit easy rather than rushing home from work, kind of half looking at the news, you know, having a bit of a chat.
Yeah.
This is a time when they might be concentrating a little bit more.
Well, there was
but I think the
on,
the purpose of a campaign launch is to announce a big bang policy and to get attention drawn to that policy because you're doing it at your campaign launch. Otherwise, it's really only for the party faithful. And I didn't think that there was a big game changer policy announcement at the Labor Party launch. It remains to be seen whether the Liberals have a big announcement at theirs, but otherwise, what's the purpose of a campaign launch if it's just getting everyone together who all agree with each other already, waving a few posters around and having some pictures?
I don't really agree with that, Christopher, and the reason is it's the message that you're trying to impart. And not all messages require a big, expensive policy. Maybe Scott Morrison should learn that lesson, because every time he opens his mouth there's another $10 million or $10 billion for this or that and the other, and Labor's actually been quite circumspect and not making big, expensive commitments. But the whole theme of the campaign launch was for a better future, and the real emphasis on cost of living and the fact that the cost of living is rising a lot faster than wages are rising. In fact, wages are barely moving at all and haven't done so for the best part of the last decade. So that was the theme, that Labor is concerned and does have policies about cost of living. You'll see more, I think, from both sides of politics talking about the cost of housing, and that was a policy initiative that was announced by Anthony Albanese yesterday to help more people into a home, lower income people into a home, through a shared equity scheme.
Well, that's I mean, I think Christopher's right in the sense that it was a pretty small housing announcement, but I think housing is such a red-hot issue. It just shows that I think that button has to be pushed. And if neither side wants to spend a lot of money and they're not going to touch tax policies like negative gearing, which most economists think they probably should, well then, you know, this is what you've got, but you've still got to send that message. So we're just past the halfway mark of this campaign. Christopher, do you have a feeling in your waters, as they say?
Well, I think Labor's campaign has settled a bit. The first couple of weeks was poor. It was almost like they were surprised that there was an election campaign, having had 3 years to prepare for it. But last week was a stronger week for Labor. The fact that inflation and interest rates have put the economy on the agenda, and not necessarily in a positive way, can be a two-edged sword for Labor and for the coalition. So the coalition will be trying to play that to say, yes, we do know that the economy is fragile. That's a good reason not to change the government. Labor will be saying, well, the government's got us to this point. Forget about international factors, wars in Ukraine, whatever. We would do a better job at managing the economy. And it'll just depend really over the next 3 weeks who manages to convince the undecided voter. What I'm hearing from Liberal pollsters is that the vote has softened for Labor, but it's gone into the middle of the ledger. So it hasn't decided. The undecideds haven't decided to go with the coalition or Labor. That number is growing, and they will make a decision closer to election day. And as I think I've said before, remember that 18% of people decided how they were going to vote in the 48 hours before the last election. Now, if it's that high, again, I'll be amazed, but it means that people are making the decision later and later, and people are less and less rusted on to a traditional political party. Unlike Craig and I, a lot of people are still deciding that the other side might be better for them than the people that they voted for before. So we're not going to know who's going to win really until much closer to election day, although Labor's definitely in the box seat, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, though the other dynamic too in elections nowadays is, while you might be right, Christopher, a lot of people are making their mind up at the last minute, a lot of people are going to make their mind up and vote in the next couple of weeks, because more and more are voting early, and I think post-pandemic that might be more of the case. But just on interest rates, you raised it. We may get an interest rate rise from the Reserve Bank tomorrow, we don't know, but certainly the inflation rate points that way. You were, both of you, in the Parliament in 2007, which is the last time the Reserve Bank raised rates in the middle of an election campaign. What was the feeling in, let me ask you, Craig, first, in Labor opposition, the Rudd opposition, and then Christopher, you in the Howard government at the time when that happened? Craig?
Oh, well, it certainly didn't help Mr Howard, and we know that because he still talks about the fact that the Reserve Bank, I think he might stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m. and say, bloody Reserve Bank, but they did increase interest rates during the election campaign. I was a member of the House of Representatives Economics Committee leading up to that election, and I asked the Reserve Bank Governor, Glenn Stevens, that if the data pointed to an interest rate rise, that they should do it, and it was during an election campaign, would he refrain from doing so? And he said, no, that would be irresponsible. If the data is there, we will increase interest rates. The data was there and they increased interest rates. So it'll be a pretty interesting day tomorrow, because either the Reserve Bank will increase interest rates or it will hold off and then talk about the inevitability of increasing interest rates, but it will definitely put interest rates front and centre of the conversation for the next few days at least.
Christopher, do you remember that day in 2007 in the election campaign when the Reserve Bank made that announcement?
Yeah, I do, because I was fighting for my political life, which I managed to succeed in doing so. And of course, remember, Fran, the interest rates were much higher in 2007. Right now, they're 0.1%. They're the lowest historically, one of the lowest historical figures on record. So,
yes, but is that going to matter much to people who've gone into the housing market in the last 2 years, maybe stretched themselves because the capital city and some regional city markets are so expensive? You know, they might not have much headroom.
I think it makes an enormous difference. Coming off such a very, very low rate, even if there is an increase tomorrow, and there probably will be, it's still a very low rate. I mean, we're all old enough, unfortunately, to remember 18% interest rates under the Keating government and the Hawke government, and they still won the election in 1989. So let's not forget, they're coming off a very, very low base. There's not going to be serious, severe financial hardship because of an interest rate rise tomorrow off the lowest base in history.
All right,
it won't be good news, but it certainly won't have people kind of being unable to pay back their mortgages.
All right, so just a one-word answer to this from both of you. Which side do you think it hurts more, Craig?
Oh, it hurts the coalition. It's the direction. Christopher's right about the size, but it's the direction. If it's going up, people will say it's going to go up again and again and again, and that's probably what the Reserve Bank will say, even if it doesn't increase it tomorrow. Well,
that wasn't exactly one word, but Christopher?
It hurts the coalition.
It hurts the coalition.
That was 3.
Yeah. Okay.
No, 4.
There's a lot less than yours.
Granted.
Let me stay with you, Christopher, because the Prime Minister had a mini launch of his own yesterday in Western Sydney, had the local MPs and candidates at it, but he also had Christine Deves sitting there in the front row, I noticed. Warringah is a long way from Western Sydney. Why was she there, and is this an indication that the messaging around trans athletes is really resonating in some of those outer urban and Western Sydney type seats?
No, I think that's a very big stretch, Fran. I think very few voters, if any, associate Christine Deves with that issue. So Catherine Deves with that issue solely.
Really?
You'd really have to be stretching reality to think that the country in western suburbs of Sydney or the nation in general are focusing on trans athletes as the #1 issue about which they're deciding the election. I think that is a huge jump.
So the Prime Minister talking about, you know, cancel culture and saying she won't be silenced, that's not a sort of a dog whistle in there? It's not a culture war issue?
No. No,
well,
not at all.
She cancelled herself. I mean, there was a journalist trying to get her to speak about these issues, and she had 2 burly security guards with Liberal Party lanyards around their necks, taking her off and putting her in a lift with the journalist following her, saying, do you want to say anything more about it? So it was a long way to go to get cancelled. And who did the cancelling? The Liberal Party.
All right, just finally.
I think a very, 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 very tiny slice of the Australian public and media are interested in that issue, to be frank.
OK. We've got 3 weeks to go, 19 days to be precise. There's no more big money to spend, I don't think. We've already got $1 trillion debt looming, so it couldn't be too much more. Offerings have been scant. We've got sort of some on the micro scale, which we've been discussing today. Christopher, what are they going to be talking about? What are we all going to be talking about for the next 3 weeks?
Well, I think we'll be talking about national security, the Solomon Islands. As you've seen today, the Solomon Islands has stepped back from the previous position that they've had with respect to China, the economy. The government's announced today about extension of the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, which Labor immediately matched, but the reality is that is trying to ease the cost of living pressures. I think we'll see a continued focus on the economy and national security and easing the cost of living, and Labor will try and get the election onto health and social security and pensions and aged care, and we'll see where it goes. But I mean, it's been an interesting election. I mean, it's with people dropping out for COVID, like Richard Marles is out at the moment for 7 days, and Anthony was out, of course, last week, and you don't know who it's going to hit next. It's been a very strange kind of experience, but, you know, it's still halfway to go. We're only halfway through, and as we've seen with lots and lots of footy games and elections over the years, you never want to count your chickens before they hatch.
That's right. But, Craig, would you care to count them anyway?
No, not at all. Christopher's right about that. And it will be about the cost of living. And it's not just the price rises, it's the fact that wages haven't moved, and people really do feel that. Christopher's right, it'll be about health and protecting Medicare and enhancing Medicare. But fundamentally, it'll be about bringing Australians together. You know, there's just so much division, and a lot of the rhetoric of the Prime Minister has actually been about, you know, setting Australian against Australian. I'm you know, really speaking the language of Bob Hawke here. He always thought that was the wrong way to go. And Anthony Albanese is talking about a better future, and we are at our best when we're together, not setting people against each other. So I think that will be an important theme in the coming 3 weeks.
Well, I guess it goes back to what Christopher said earlier. It depends who can make these points loudly enough, the louder, you know, louder than the other. Christopher, Craig, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks, Fran.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, well, whether we call them luminaries or elders, it's always interesting to get the perspectives, Fran.
I'm sticking with veterans.
Veterans, all right, who've been around for a while, particularly when we are talking about interest rates and the experience of 15 years ago. We're talking here about 2007. It really is etched in the minds of players who were there at that time, politicians, exactly how significant and how charged interest rates were as a political issue at the time. Not saying that would be the same tomorrow.
Well, I think it's a fair point. The rates were much higher then, but at the same time, I still believe there's a lot of people here who have stretched so hard to get into this housing market, because mortgages, you know, as a percentage of your wage or a times of your wage, never been higher. So a lot of people have really pushed, because there's a sense that if you don't get in now and you don't ever get in, then you're never going to accumulate wealth. I mean, that's the equaliser, isn't it? Without it, we've got this inbuilt inequality that's just going to get more and more entrenched.
Yeah, highly geared around the great Australian dream. Why don't we head off to a single electorate now, as we try to do occasionally throughout our coverage over the course of the campaign. As we've mentioned, we are officially at the halfway mark, or just beyond it. There's only 19 days left of campaigning. Come election night, many eyes will fall on the marginal seat of Eden-Monaro in New South Wales, which is not seen as highly volatile, not maybe as volatile as it used to be back in the day. It used to be
the bellwether seat, didn't it? Always Eden-Monaro.
It's decoupled a little from that tradition these days, but it's still tight on the numbers. It's held by federal Labor MP Kristy McBain, and we caught up with her a short time ago. Kristy McBain, congratulations. You've made it to the halfway mark of what is always a gruelling exercise, isn't it? A federal election campaign. Voting opens next week. Do you have a sense of what traffic is coming through your office when it comes to postal votes? And, you know, do you really expect the activity to step up come Monday next week?
Yeah, I think so. From a lot of people I've been speaking to around the electorate, they're really keen to exercise their democratic right and vote on May 21 or before. We've seen a lot of application for postal votes already come through, and we've had a lot of inquiries about where to pre-poll. So there are a lot of people who are really keen to get out and vote already. And obviously a lot of inquiries about policy issues and how they'll impact a place like Eden-Monaro. So We've been answering a lot of those calls and emails. We've been doing a lot of phone banking and door knocking and speaking to constituents right across this very large electorate.
And on the policy front, has much come in the last 24 hours or so since the ALP's launch in Perth on this shared equity housing investment or co-ownership proposal that your party's put forward?
As I said, we've been out and about over the weekend as well, and yesterday we were in parts of the electorate around the Queanbeyan region, and one of the biggest issues was still cost of living. We've had a lot of inquiry about cost of living issues, but after the housing announcement made by the Labor Party yesterday at the campaign launch, we've obviously seen a lot of interest and inquiry about how that would suit certain people's circumstances. So it's obviously piqued a lot of interest and inquiry. This housing issue is right across the country, and Eden-Monaro has definitely borne the brunt of that. I think we've seen a lot of people moving to regional areas from our cities during COVID, and it is very difficult to find a house to rent. It's hard to afford a house to rent, and it's even harder to buy. So anything that helps us to reduce the housing pressure in our system at the moment, I think will be much appreciated by Australians all over. Yeah, with only 10,000 places offered nationally under this ALP proposal, though, you couldn't reasonably expect a very large number of those to fall in southeast New South Wales, could you? Well, 10,000 places is better than none, and this housing crisis has erupted under the Morrison government's watch. So we all need to do whatever we can to ease the burden on households, including the housing crisis. It requires 3 levels of government coming together, and what you've seen is the Labor Party actually put forward policy to start to deal with this housing crisis, making sure that we are working together with other levels of government. And what you've seen us put forward is a damn sight better than what the other side have put forward. All right, now we've also had this announcement matched by Labor today. It was an announcement that came from the coalition to expand the eligible income you can have in order to access the seniors' health card. Are you entirely sure that's fair in some of the thresholds here? I mean, for couples, they're pushing it up to annual income levels of $144,000, which in your part of the world is, I would suggest, quite a high income. Oh, look, across the country, we've got people on varying levels of income. I think what you've seen from the Labor Party is that we're not going to be dogmatic in not accepting ideas that are good. You know, the Labor Party was the party that put forward the idea of wage subsidies, which was laughed out of hand and said it was a dangerous precedent to set. And then we saw the coalition adopt it and rebrand it as JobKeeper. You know, they should have been smart enough to say, look, that's a good idea, it will help our country, let's get on with it. But they didn't, because they couldn't be seen to be agreeing with us. We know that the cost of living is difficult for everyone at this point in time, people on low and middle incomes. And whatever we can do to ease that burden, we should be trying to do now, which is why we've said, look, that is a good idea. Let's make sure it happens. OK, so middle income, by definition here, cuts out at about $150,000, $140,000, somewhere around there, does it, for households or for couples at least? Well, look, I think when you look at the data, it now suggests that the average household income is about $68,000 per person. So if you are looking at a couple, it would be around that mark, yes. Yep. All right, interest rates. Are you bracing for, do you expect that the Reserve Bank will go ahead and start the upward movements on official rates tomorrow? Well, look, this comes on top of the highest inflation numbers we have seen in about 30 years. The Reserve Bank is an independent group, and they obviously need to make their decisions regardless of what's happening in terms of electoral cycles. I'm not sure whether they will move interest rates or not. If they do, it's obviously because they know that the data suggests that it has to go up to try to cap what we are seeing in inflation at this point in time. well, let's see what comes of tomorrow.
But the pain, I mean, based on levels of indebtedness in your electorate, you know, as against, say, comparisons with Sydney, still pretty high. So that pain, if not with the first move, then with subsequent moves, is going to be acute on household budgets.
Look, any move in interest rates is going to impact households no matter where they are across the country. We know that wages have been stagnant now for the last decade, and that was a deliberate design feature of the Coalition's economic policy, which Matthias Cormann outlined to us. We need to make sure that wages are moving, that they can cope with the increase in the cost of goods, that they can cope with any massive increases in interest rates. We need to come together as a country and make sure that the policies that we are putting together at this election will help householders, that we have listened to Australians who are telling us how tough it is for them on the ground. Yeah. That's why the Labor Party has the suite of policies it does, because we've listened to people over the last 3 years. Grassroots politics is where we have placed ourselves. We know how tough it is for people, and that's why we have policies that will deal with the cost of living pressures, the housing crisis, the aged care crisis, making childcare cheaper, trying to make more things here in Australia. Because we know if we do not start getting our economy moving, then we are at risk of being isolated.
Yeah. Kristy McBain, I know you've got a lot more campaigning to do before this day is out, so we'll thank you once again for joining us on Afternoon Briefing, and talk again soon.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, is the great Australian dream of owning your own home dead? That was a question put to the Prime Minister today as housing affordability became a key issue in this campaign. Scott Morrison says the dream's not dead, but he was highly critical of Labor's housing policy for a shared equity scheme to help low and middle income earners purchase homes.
What Labor have been very clear about is they have a share in your home, and so as your home value increases, they're making money off you. So as your home price goes up, your home value goes up, they are taking a cut. And so you have to pay the government back on their equity and with the capital appreciation. I mean, they are basically riding on your decision to buy your own home.
I'm joined now by Brendan Coates, who's the Grattan Institute's Economic Policy Program Director, and Eliza Owen, who's the Head of Residential Research at CoreLogic. Welcome, both of you.
Good afternoon.
Brendan, Labor's Help to Buy scheme would see the government take up to 40% equity in a purchased property for lower income earners. The Grattan Institute proposed a scheme very similar to this. Why do you think it's a good idea?
We think, Fran, this is an important piece of the puzzle. It's not a panacea that's going to solve housing affordability in Australia, but it's important because it deals with the problem of older Australians struggling to be able to afford to buy their own home. So the issue for older Australians is the fact that they really, for them, it's the ability to, they've often got a couple $100,000 from a separation, they have a little bit of money. What they could struggle to do is to actually pay down that home by the time they retire. And a shared equity scheme would allow them to do that, because home ownership's falling not just amongst younger people, it's also falling amongst older Australians. So home ownership amongst the poorest 40% of those aged 45 to 54, that's gone from 71% to 55%, and that's the group that if we don't do something about that, they're at risk of poverty in retirement, and half of retirees that rent today are in poverty.
So this is aimed more at, it's not aimed at first home buyers like the deposit scheme the government's put forward and Labor's also matched. It's aimed at older workers, perhaps older women perhaps. But how are they going to feel about, you know, having a government of the day own part of their house and part of their profits if they want to downsize? I mean, that's the point the Prime Minister was hitting hard today.
So I think the issue for this cohort is if they don't actually have that support, then they won't own their own home at all. So if you're in a position where you can afford to buy the home without using the shared equity scheme, then I suspect you will probably do so. I suspect you'll probably use the guarantee that's on offer from the government and is being matched by Labor.
Eliza, do you think this is a good policy? Do you think people will go for it? Scott Morrison made the point there's already private share equity homes. So do you think this is going to take off, this scheme? Or the scare campaign there or the criticisms, let me call it that, from the Prime Minister are going to resonate? Eliza?
Well, I think that it's something that is a little more targeted towards those low and middle income earners. So that strikes me as a positive for the shared equity scheme, where something like the first home loan deposit scheme had these income caps that were relatively high and may have been taken advantage by people who would have ended up in home ownership anyway. So from that perspective, I can see the benefit of a shared equity scheme. And I'd agree with Brendan as well that by the government investing in that stake in the home, it's allowing people to actually take on lower home loans, which will help their housing costs as well.
Well, the Coalition has a policy that the Prime Minister announced at the last election, but they've in the budget they've increased it for helping people into home ownership through the first home loan deposit scheme. Scott Morrison says it's helped almost 300,000 people get into home ownership, the first home buyers. Is it useful to do a comparison of these two policies? Are they both good? Is one better than the other? Eliza, what do you think of the first home loan deposit scheme?
I mean, I think it's really interesting that both sides of the political spectrum there have kind of shifted towards this idea of helping people over the barriers to home ownership rather than, you know, a revolution or looking to bring home prices down. So from that perspective, I think they're comparable, is this shift in our approach to housing systematically. I guess the main difference for me, again, would just be that the home equity scheme is a bit smaller, a little more targeted, but that, I guess, is also a trade-off that you have to take into account when you're not wanting to add too much demand to the market at that lower middle income level as well.
Just on that, I want to come back to the other point you made, Eliza, but Brendan, it is a smallish scheme. 10,000 people per year would be helped by it. Does it lack ambition? What do you think?
No, we actually support a targeted scheme. When Grattan put forward a proposal like this in February, it was for 5,000 of these schemes a year. So 10,000 is not an enormous expansion on what we proposed. The scheme is, the risk with the demand side is if you add to demand, you add to purchasing power, you raise prices. This scheme is small enough that I don't think that that's a genuine risk here. And because it is targeted, you're likely to actually get people using this scheme that genuinely otherwise probably wouldn't be able to buy their own home.
How much do these schemes add to demand? How much do both of the, well, we've seen the government scheme working, the first homeowners deposit scheme, and if we talk about this one that Labor's offering, how much would they be responsible for pushing home prices up? Brendan and then Eliza?
Well, look, it's a $9 trillion housing market, Fran. So in this context, you know, you're talking a couple of $1 billion of extra demand from this scheme. Now, by 2030, we'd expect the equity stake would be worth $12 billion. So it's just a drop in the bucket compared to the size of the housing market. Other things like interest rates will have much more of an impact on prices.
Eliza, what about the current scheme, the first homeowners deposit scheme? Has that had an impact on prices, do you think? So there is some criticism that it's forced prices up.
I mean, I'd agree that I think 10,000 places a year is fairly modest and probably not something that's going to significantly contribute to an increase in house prices. But we have to remember that there's a culmination of different factors which have really created a concentration in demand and has contributed to very high home prices at the moment. This, of course, includes record low interest rates, but also having on top of that things like home builder, the fact that there wasn't as much transaction activity between 2017 and 2019 when we had a falling market. There wasn't as much transaction activity through lockdowns. So I'd be really interested to see how quickly these schemes are taken up now that we're coming into a kind of softer housing market environment, or whether potential applicants might actually be wary of potential fall in house prices.
Eliza, that point you made earlier about both these policies being geared more at helping people get the deposits together to get into this rocketing market rather than trying to bring prices down. Is that a good thing in your view? Is that the right emphasis? And what would be the policy levers to do the opposite, bring prices down? Are we back talking about negative gearing? And should we be talking about negative gearing?
I mean, is it a good thing? You know, maybe you need to talk to a philosopher and not an economist. I suppose one thing that's worth noting is that house prices have become implicitly a pillar of retirement, aged care, potential for funding healthcare. So I can see the double-edged sword in needing to kind of keep house prices high in a way. If I think about myself as an individual, it's hard to get into the market. But I know that if, for example, the value of my parents' home fell, they're going to be looking for support in their retirement and healthcare, and that might end up having to come from me. So, for some people, I can definitely see the benefit in having those house prices more maintained.
Brendan, what do you think? Should we be looking at other levers like negative gearing?
The fact that we're having this debate about these two schemes points to the diminished ambitions we have for housing affordability in Australia, Fran. So we do need, if you want to deal with housing affordability in the long term, we're going to have to deal with the supply side, relaxing planning rules to build more in our major cities. It does mean looking at those tax settings again. Neither of those things are on the table this election campaign, but they will need to be in future.
Yeah, well, supply side, we've been talking about that a long time, and even when supply comes in, it often means people living way away from city centres or where centres of work might be. But just finally, the ABC's financial expert Alan Kohler wrote recently, education and hard work no longer determine how wealthy you are. Now it comes down to where you live and what sort of house you inherit. Should we try to do something about that? I am going to ask you all both to philosophise. Brenda?
Well, look, we have a growing divide between the housing haves and have-nots, and if we don't fix housing affordability, then that's going to get worse. So rising house prices are contributing to rising wealth inequality in Australia today, and we need to decide what kind of future we want to leave, for our children and for future generations. And unfortunately, the best chance you have of buying a home is to have a parent that already owns one.
And Eliza, a lot of young people don't. So what does it say about their future and the gap that's opening up here? Can you already see this?
Yeah, we've definitely seen the rates of home ownership among younger, poorer Australians deteriorate more significantly over time. That is an inequality that we need to target and make sure that we have secure housing options, even for those who might not get into home ownership.
All right, Eliza Owen and Brendan Coates, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so afternoon briefing delves a little into philosophy. I wonder what Plato and Socrates might have thought about home affordability.
Come on, Greg, you're a philosophical kind of guy. I can never shut you up. Yeah, you're always, thinking about big ideas.
One thing I am thinking about, and it was a point raised by Eliza Owen, as much as the Prime Minister makes the point, in a rising house market, they're going to take a share of your home, they being the government. In a potential falling house market, that means the government would also wear a bit of the haircut that's taken from the original outlay as well. So it swings and roundabouts when you're talking about.
Well, that's true. This scheme or schemes like it already exist in a few of the states and also in other countries like Canada, for instance, and the UK. And yes, it is. There is a money-making element to it for governments over time. So they make the investment up front. Then if house prices rise, as they have been in Australia for a long time, they'll take some of that when the asset rises in price too. I suppose the question then is, what are governments doing with that? Are they reinvesting that into the pot to allow more to buy into a scheme? Well,
I think that has
surely you'd have to have this managed by a housing facility.
Yeah, and I don't think the primary motivation behind any of them has been to make money. That's like a spin-off benefit if you can manage it. The primary purpose is housing affordability. But yeah, it swings and roundabouts. You just can't be certain, particularly in what she describes, Eliza Owen, as a soft housing market. It could actually be at a point when it's created.
The point is, this is tinkering around the edges, and neither party is politically brave enough to look at negative gearing, which we know is a lever that will change the makeup of the housing market and therefore will ultimately take some of the heat out of it. But that goes into people's superannuation and future earnings and all that. So that is a very politically difficult thing to be doing.
That much we can conclude. That one is way too hot to handle here in 2022. Just ask Chris Bowen and Bill Shorten 3 years ago. They might testify to that. That's about all the time we have for afternoon briefing today. As we said at the outset, great to have you with us here in the Parliament House studios, Fran, and we'll both be back tomorrow.
Back again tomorrow. See you then. Thanks so much for joining us.
This is a big business. The medical side of it doesn't seem to be a concern. Just making money. That's all they're in for.